Chapter 1. The unveiling the Harrington residence in Belgrave Square had long been known for its dignified restraint. It was not a house that shouted its wealth. It suggested it quietly, in the depth of its carpets, the polish of its banisters, and the discreet gleam of old silver that had outlived generations. On the evening of the unveiling, however, restraint gave way to expectancy. The chandeliers, dimmed to a mellow glow, cast a trembling light over faces drawn by inheritance, ambition, and curiosity. At the far end of the drawing room, upon an easel draped in velvet, stood the portrait of the late Jonathan Harrington, industrial magnate, philanthropist and tyrant, depending upon whom one asked. He had died 3 months earlier in what had been declared a tragic accident at his country estate. A fall from the stone terrace, they said, a misstep in the dark. Yet it was not his death that had gathered the family now, but his likeness. The canvas was large, imposing. Even the gilt frame, newly fashioned, gleamed against the shadowed paneling. Before it stood Clara Harrington, her pale hands clasped tightly before her black silk gown. She was the younger child, unmarried, and possessed of a gentleness that many mistook for weakness. Beside her loomed her elder brother, Edwin Harrington, tall and spare, his expression perpetually sharpened by impatience. Margaret Lane, Jonathan's widowed sister, sat upright in a high-backed chair, her silver hair arranged with uncompromising precision. Thomas Reed, Jonathan's former secretary, and now executor of the estate, hovered with professional composure near the mantel. And slightly apart from them all, as though observing a tableau arranged for his private inspection, stood Hercule Poirot. He had been invited at Clara's insistence. The official explanation had been that the Harrington family desired a distinguished guest for the unveiling, a man of reputation, a symbol of intellect and discernment. But Poirot's presence was rarely accidental, and his eyes, bright and reflective, missed nothing. The artist, a fashionable portraitist named Lawrence Whitcomb, cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began. "It was my privilege to capture Mr. Harrington as he wished to be remembered." A servant stepped forward, and at Whitcomb's nod, drew the velvet drape aside. The painting emerged into the light. Jonathan Harrington was depicted seated in a high leather chair, one hand resting upon the carved head of a cane. His features were rendered with meticulous detail, the broad brow, the firm chin, the lips curved in what might have been a smile. His dark eyes, painted with extraordinary depth, seemed almost to glisten. For a moment, silence. Then a murmur, soft at first, like wind against glass. Clara Harrington. "Its beautiful father looks so kind." Edwin Harrington. "Kind, that smile is cutting." Margaret Lane. "I see warmth, nothing more." Thomas Reed. "Stand to the left. There, do you not see the sneer?" Poirot. "Curious. One painting, 2 judgments." Clara. "Surely art affects us differently." Poirot. "Or it is meant to." The word settled over the gathering like a fine dust, for it was true, remarkably true, that the portrait altered with perspective. From one angle, Jonathan's expression seemed softened by benevolence. From another, the curve of his mouth sharpened, acquiring a faint and unmistakable cruelty. Even the eyes appeared to shift, now sympathetic, now appraising, now cold. Whitcomb, pale beneath his fashionable beard, forced a laugh. "An effect of light and shadow, I assure you, a technique, nothing more." "Nothing more," Edwin repeated. "You have painted our father as a man divided." "I painted him as I saw him," Whitcomb replied stiffly. Margaret Lane's gaze did not leave the canvas. "Jonathan was never divided," she said quietly. "He was perfectly consistent." "And in what manner?" Aunt Clara asked. "In the manner of a man who always meant exactly what he said." Poirot took a step closer to the portrait. He folded his hands behind his back, tilting his head slightly. The polished floor reflected the faintest shimmer of gold from the frame. "Permit me," he murmured. He shifted his position, first to the right, then to the left. Each time, the expression changed with subtle but undeniable force. The technique was masterful, of that there could be no doubt. The brushstrokes were layered in such a way that highlights and shadows contended for dominance depending upon the observer's stance. An admirable illusion, Poirot said at last. One might almost believe that Monsieur Harrington wished to be outside. Beyond the tall windows of Belgrave Square, the night pressed close against the glass. Within, beneath the dim chandeliers, Jonathan Harrington's painted eyes seemed to gleam with private knowledge. And Hercule Poirot, watching the watchers, knew that the unveiling had revealed far more than a portrait. It had uncovered the first crack in a carefully constructed essai-faire. The argument had begun before the applause had ended. The investigation, though unspoken, had begun as well. Chapter 2. The divided room after the first shock. The Harrington drawing room did what drawing rooms always did in moments of strain. It rearranged itself into smaller, safer shapes. People found reasons to drift toward the windows, the drinks table, the fire. Voices softened. Laughter appeared in brief, brittle bursts, like a thin glaze over something that might crack at any touch. But the portrait did not soften. It watched them all with its deep, painted eyes, its mouth poised in that troubling curve that could be kindness or contempt, depending on where one stood. And now, with the small crimson mark near the cane's head, it seemed less like a commissioned likeness and more like a signal, placed there to provoke, to stir, to direct attention. Clara remained nearest the easel, as though proximity could steady her. Edwin kept his distance, but not far enough to escape the portrait's pull. Margaret Lane returned to her chair, upright and severe, her eyes fixed on guests rather than canvas. Thomas Reed moved among the murmuring circle with the brisk calm of a man determined to prevent collapse. Poirot, meanwhile, did not join any cluster. He stood at the edge perfectly still, as if he had become part of the room's architecture. Yet his attention was everywhere. On hands that tightened around glasses, on glances that darted then dropped, on footsteps that shifted position by inches. The family's guests began to withdraw in ones and twos, murmuring excuses. It became, as the evening thinned, more private. The velvet drape lay folded and forgotten on a nearby table, like a discarded disguise. Clara turned abruptly to Whitcomb, who hovered close by the mantel, pale as a candle. "Mr. Whitcomb," she said, "you truly did not paint that mark." The artist's throat bobbed. "On my honor, Miss Harrington, I would never vandalize my own work." Widwin's laugh was low and unpleasant. "Vandalize? Perhaps you consider it an improvement, a private joke." Whitcomb's eyes flashed. "I am not in the habit of joking at my patrons." "Patrons," Edwin repeated. "Or victims." Thomas Reed stepped in quickly. "Enough, Mr. Whitcomb. You may leave if you wish. The family will speak with you later." Whitcomb looked relieved to have permission, and yet terrified to accept it. He bowed stiffly and departed. When the door closed behind him, the room seemed to contract. The quiet that followed was not peaceful, it was charged, as though the house itself had begun to listen. Edwin moved toward the portrait at last, drawn with the reluctant compulsion of a man approaching a wound. He stopped at a particular spot, slightly right of center, then lifted his chin. "From this angle," he said, voice tight. "Father mocks me." Clara's eyes widened. "You always imagined criticism. You call it imagination, I call it experience." Margaret's cane tapped once on the floor, sharp and impatient. "Please, this is absurd." Poirot, who had been watching Edwin's feet rather than his face, spoke with quiet authority. "Do not move, Mr. Edwin. Remain where you stand." Edwin turned sharply. "What?" Thomas Reed frowned. "Why does that matter?" Poirot's gaze moved to the chandelier, then to the lamps on the side tables. Their warm pools of light overlapped, leaving subtle gradients across the room. In those gradients the portrait shifted, the painted mouth gaining or losing its softness. "Because," Poirot said, "the light chooses sides." Widwin's lips thinned. "Light cannot change truth." Poirot's eyes met his. "Ah, but it can change perception." The words hung there simple, almost mild. Yet oddly unsettling, Clara's fingers tightened on the back of a chair. Margaret's expression remained composed, but her gaze sharpened as if she had been challenged. Poirot stepped forward. "Mr. Reed, would you be so kind as to stand where Mr. Edwin stands now?" Reed hesitated. He was a man accustomed to instructions. He had lived by them in Jonathan Harrington's service, but he did not like this one. Still, he moved carefully into Edwin's place. "Now," Poirot murmured, "tell me what you see." Your Reed looked up at the portrait. His brows drew together. "It looks sterner. The eyes are colder, and the mouth a little twisted." Poirot nodded. "And if you stand where Miss Harrington stands?" Reed shifted left. The effect was immediate. The face softened. The smile became almost paternal. Reed blinked, as if unsure whether he trusted his own senses. "It changes," he said reluctantly. "It changes for all of us," Poirot replied, "and perhaps it changed for the late Mr. Harrington too, depending upon who was standing before him." Widwin's voice cut in. "Are you suggesting father behaved differently with different people?" Clara spoke softly. "He did." Margaret's eyes flashed. "He behaved as a father ought, according to the character of the child." Widwin gave a short, humorless sound, and according to his own appetite for control. Clara's face tightened. "He loved you." "Love," Edwin said, "can also be a leash." Poirot watched them with a stillness that was almost tender. He had seen families before, families of all classes, all types. Grief did not unify, it magnified. It took everything that had been spoken softly in life and forced it into the open after death. He walked closer to the canvas again, examining the crimson mark. It was small, yet it exerted a peculiar authority, like the final word in an argument. "Miss Harrington," Poirot said, "you said your father spoke of misunderstandings. Did he ever specify what these were?" Clara's mouth opened, then closed. Her eyes flicked to Thomas Reed, then to Margaret, then to Edwin. It was as if she feared each of them in a different way. "I cannot say," she murmured, "not with everyone listening." Widwin's eyes narrowed. "You know something." "I know impressions," Clara said, "nothing certain." Margaret rose again, the cane steadying her. "This is not the time for theatrics. Jonathan's will is to be read tomorrow. That is what matters." "The will," Edwin said, his tone darkening. "Yes, that will matter very much." Poirot's gaze shifted to him at once. "Why, Mr. Edwin, do you expect a surprise?" Edwin's mouth tightened. "My father enjoyed surprises." Thomas Reed spoke with forced briskness. "There will be no surprises. Mr. Harrington's affairs were clear." Poirot noticed the faint pause before the word clear. He also noticed the way Reed's hand drifted toward his pocket, then withdrew, as though resisting a habit. "Mr. Reed," Poirot asked gently, "you were your employer's secretary. You knew him well." Reed's eyes flickered. "As well as anyone could know, Mr. Harrington." "A diplomatic answer," Poirot said. "And yet perhaps it is the true one. Some men are always partly concealed." Margaret's gaze fixed on Poirot. "Monsieur Poirot, what precisely do you imply?" "Nothing that is not already present in this room," Poirot replied softly. "The portrait divides you. The division existed before the portrait. It only makes visible what was already there." Widwin's face hardened. "The portrait doesn't divide us, father did," Clara whispered. "Please, Edwin." "No," he snapped. "Not now, not again with the pleading. He is dead, but he still dictates the mood, the conversation, even the angle at which we stand." Poirot's eyes sharpened slightly. "You speak as though you are still obeying him." Widwin's jaw worked. He looked away. Margaret stepped forward, her voice controlled. "Jonathan Harrington built this family. He built a fortune. He demanded discipline. Yes, but he also offered security." Widwin laughed again, the sound brittle, security for those who pleased him. "And what of you?" Margaret asked coldly. "Did you not benefit? Did you not sit at his table, wear his name?" Widwin's eyes flared. "And do you think that absolves him? Do you think it erases?" He stopped abruptly. Poirot's attention tightened like a drawn thread. "Erases what?" "Mr. Edwin." Lidwin's gaze flicked to the portrait, then to the crimson mark. "Nothing," he said, too quickly. "Forget it." Thomas Reed cleared his throat. "We are all tired. It has been a long day." Poirot watched him carefully. Reed's tone was reasonable, but his eyes were restless, as if searching the room for something. "Mr. Reed," Poirot said. "A question. When did you first notice the crimson mark?" Reed stiffened. "This evening, with the rest of you." "And you, Miss Harrington?" Clara swallowed. "This evening. And you, Mrs. Lane?" Margaret's chin lifted. "This evening, of course." Poirot turned to Edwin. Edwin's pause was fractionally longer than the others. "This evening?" Poirot nodded slowly, as if accepting the answers at face value, yet his eyes did not. He was not merely collecting information, he was measuring the manner in which it was given. Inside, the lamps burned steadily, and yet shadows seemed to shift with every movement of a body. Poirot stepped back and addressed them in a tone that was conversational, almost light. "I do not think the portrait is only a portrait," he said. "I think it is, how shall I say it, a mechanism." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "A mechanism?" "Yes, something designed to create an effect, not only of art, but of emotion." Edwin's voice was sharp. "You mean Father planned this?" "I do not know yet," Poirot replied. "But I know this, the portrait is not simply reflecting your divisions. It is shaping them, encouraging them, like a fire that takes advantage of dry wood." Clara's face went white. But why would he? Why would anyone? Poirot's gaze moved again to the crimson mark. To provoke confession, to provoke anger, to provoke a mistake. Thomas Reed's voice was cautious. "That is a dramatic theory." Poirot smiled faintly. "Often, Mr. Reed, the dramatic theory is the correct one, because human beings are dramatic creatures." He stepped nearer to the portrait again and examined the painted cane. The lion head looked fierce, carved in miniature, and there, beneath it, the small crimson stroke sat like a punctuation mark. Poirot's eyes drifted downward, noting the easel's legs, the polished floor beneath. He saw faint scuffs, newer than the older marks. Someone had moved the easel recently, perhaps very recently. He did not comment. "Not yet. Instead," he said, lightly, "tell me who has access to this room at night." Clara looked startled. "The servants, of course. The footman, the housekeeper, and the family, of course." Poirot nodded, as though the answer were expected. In such houses, privacy was an illusion. There were always eyes, always hands, always keys. Margaret's voice was clipped. "Monsieur Poirot, if you are implying sabotage, I assure you this family will handle it." Poirot inclined his head. "Certainly. Yet it is often the family that is least able to handle it, madam, because the family is never impartial." Widwin's gaze flicked toward Thomas Reed. "What do you think, Reed? Shall we handle it like we handled everything else?" Weird's face tightened. "I do not know what you mean." Widwin took a step closer, and for a moment the air between them seemed to crackle. Clara moved instinctively as if to intervene, then stopped, caught between loyalties. Poirot observed the geometry of it all, Edwin positioned between Reed and the portrait, Clara nearer the canvas, Margaret at the edge of the firelight. They were not merely standing in a room, they were arranged like pieces on a board, and Jonathan Harrington's painted face, shifting with each angle, seemed to approve of the arrangement. Poirot's tone became gentle again. "Perhaps we end the evening," he suggested. "We have had enough of the portrait for one night." Margaret exhaled sharply, as though grateful for permission. "Yes, we will retire." Clara hesitated. Her eyes lingered on her father's face, on the softened angle she alone seemed to see. "Good night," she whispered, not to the room, but to the canvas. Edwin did not speak. He turned away abruptly, the movement sharp like a man snapping a thread. Thomas Reed stepped forward and reached for the velvet drape. His hand shook slightly as he lifted it. Poirot watched him. "You will cover it, Mr. Reed?" Reed's voice was stiff. "It seems best." Poirot nodded. Yes, it seems best. But as the drape fell over the portrait, hiding the shifting mouth and judging eyes, Poirot's gaze sharpened with a quiet certainty. Covering it did not lessen its power. It only delayed the moment when the room would have to face it again. And in that delay, someone would act, because division, once awakened, seldom returns obediently to sleep. Chapter 3. The painter's promise the following morning dawned pale and restrained, as though the city itself were uncertain how much light to permit after the disturbances of the previous evening. A faint mist clung to the streets, softening the sharp lines of Belgrave Square and muting the sound of passing carriages. Within the Harrington residence, however, clarity was demanded rather than withheld. The portrait remained veiled in the drawing room. No one had yet suggested its removal. It stood where it had been unveiled, like a presence acknowledged but not confronted. Hercule Poirot, punctual as ever, requested that Adrian Wells be summoned. The artist arrived shortly before 11. He was a man in his early 40s, slim and impeccably dressed, with hands that seemed too delicate for anything but brushes and silk gloves. His hair was brushed back from a high forehead, and his expression carried the composed humility of a man accustomed to patronage, but careful never to appear dependent upon it. He removed his hat and gloves in the entrance hall, and was shown into the smaller morning room, where Poirot awaited him alone. The room was bright, the curtains drawn back to allow a generous spill of winter light across the carpet. On a small table between them stood a silver coffee service, untouched. "Mr. Wells," Poirot began pleasantly, gesturing to a chair, "I am grateful you agreed to return so promptly." Wells inclined his head. "Under the circumstances, I felt it necessary. My reputation, you understand." "Your reputation," Poirot echoed, settling opposite him. "It is a delicate varnish. Once scratched, it is not easily restored." Wells's fingers tightened slightly on his gloves. "You imply I have scratched something." "Not at all. I imply only that perception, like varnish, alters what lies beneath." Wells gave a restrained smile. "You are a man who appreciates nuance." "I try." There was a pause. Poirot observed the artist carefully, the neatness of his cuffs, the faint trace of pigment beneath one fingernail, the steady gaze that met his without flinching. Wells was not a man easily rattled. "Mr. Wells," Poirot said gently, "you are known for subtle techniques. I am flattered that you know my work. I know that you experiment with layered glazes and directional strokes, that you believe light should not merely illuminate a subject, but participate in it." Wells's brows lifted slightly. "That is a fair description." "And in the Harrington portrait," Poirot continued, "you layered the expression deliberately." Wells's hands stilled. "I layered the face," he replied carefully, "as I do with all faces. Flesh is not flat. Emotion is not singular." "Indeed," Poirot said softly. "You anticipated the unveiling would stir emotion?" Wells leaned back, folding his gloves neatly in his lap. "Emotion is the purpose of portraiture, but conflict." A faint tightening crossed Wells's mouth. "Conflict is often the byproduct of truth." "Ah," Poirot murmured, "you paint truth. I paint what I see in a man." Poirot tilted his head. "And what did you see in Jonathan Harrington?" Wells hesitated, not from uncertainty, but from deliberation. "I saw strength," he said at last. "Authority, a mind that calculated outcomes before others had grasped the premise." And nothing else. A shadow flickered across Wells's expression. "There are always other things." "Cruelty," Poirot suggested gently. Wells did not immediately answer. At that moment, the door opened without ceremony. Margaret Lane entered, upright and composed, her cane tapping softly against the carpet. "I trust I do not interrupt," she said coolly. "Not at all, madam," Poirot replied. She seated herself without invitation, her gaze settling upon Wells with quiet appraisal. "My brother was decisive," Margaret said, "not cruel." Wells inclined his head politely. "I meant no disrespect." "Then you deny that the portrait suggests cruelty?" "I deny nothing," Wells replied evenly. "I paint what I see in a man." Margaret's eyes sharpened. "Then perhaps you misjudged him." Wells met her gaze without hostility. "Or perhaps some saw cruelty in him." A silence fell. Poirot observed Margaret's hand upon her cane. It tightened fractionally. Or wished to, Poirot added quietly. Wells's eyes flicked toward him. You suggest, the artist said slowly, that perception is chosen. Sometimes, Poirot replied, it is encouraged. Margaret turned her attention to Poirot. Encouraged by whom? That is what I seek to discover. He rose and crossed to the window, looking out briefly at the square below before turning back. Mr. Wells, tell me about your sittings with Mr. Harrington. They were regular, 3 afternoons a week, for nearly a month. Was anyone else present? Not during the sittings themselves. Yet you must have observed the household. Wells nodded. Of course. And what did you observe? The artist's expression grew thoughtful. Tension, not overt, not theatrical, but present. Your brother. He corrected himself quickly. The secretary brought documents for signature even during sessions. Margaret's gaze flickered. Jonathan conducted business constantly. Indeed, Wells agreed. He seemed to prefer it. Poirot studied him. Did Mr. Harrington ever speak of how he wished to be remembered? Wells's answer came without delay. Yes. Margaret's cane tapped once. And he said he wished to be seen clearly. Clearly, Poirot echoed. As he was. Not softened, not forgiven. Margaret stiffened. That is a peculiar ambition. Wells's voice remained calm. He was a peculiar man. The room grew very still. Poirot approached again, stopping before Wells. Did he instruct you regarding the expression? Not directly, but indirectly. Wells allowed himself a faint, rueful smile. Mr. Harrington did not need to issue instructions. He arranged himself. He spoke in a particular tone. He positioned his head in a certain way. He was deliberate. Deliberate, Poirot repeated, as though constructing a message. Wells hesitated. I am an artist, he said finally. I record what is placed before me, but you also interpret. Yes, and you understand families. A flicker of something, almost amusement, crossed Wells's face. An artist, he said softly, spends much time in drawing rooms. One cannot avoid understanding families. Margaret rose abruptly. This is pointless. The portrait is complete. It will not change because we interrogate the painter. Poirot's gaze moved to her. No, madam, it will not change, but what it reveals may. She regarded him steadily. Be careful, Monsieur Poirot. Not every revelation is welcome. With that, she turned and left the room. Wells exhaled quietly once the door closed. She loved him, he said. Did she? Poirot asked mildly. Yes, Wells replied, in her way. And what of the son? Wells's fingers resumed their careful folding of the gloves. He felt measured, judged, found wanting at least. That was my impression. And the daughter? Wells's voice softened. She felt protective. Of her father, of the memory of him. Poirot nodded slowly. And you, Mr. Wells? What did you feel? The question was unexpected. Wells's eyes widened slightly. I felt, he said after a moment, that I was painting a man who expected something to happen. Expected? Yes. What sort of thing? An exposure. The word lingered between them. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Explain. Wells leaned forward, lowering his voice. During the final sitting, Mr. Harrington said something curious. He asked whether a portrait could reveal what others refused to see. And what did you answer? I said that a portrait could suggest, it could not compel. And he smiled, the same smile. Wells did not answer at once. Yes, he said finally, the same. Poirot walked slowly across the room, considering. Mr. Wells, you claim the dual expression was accidental, an effect of depth and varnish. Yes, and yet you speak of suggestion. Every artist suggests, Wells replied evenly, but suggestion is not sabotage. And the crimson mark, Wells's composure faltered for the first time. I did not paint it. You are certain? Absolutely. Poirot studied him intently. There was fear there, but not the fear of guilt. It was the fear of being implicated in something beyond one's design. "Mr. Wells," Poirot said quietly, "did anyone else have access to the portrait before it was delivered here?" "It remained in my studio until 3 days ago. Then it was transported directly to this house." "Sealed? In a crate?" "Yes." "Who supervised its unpacking?" "Mr. Reed." Poirot nodded slowly. "Wells rose, Monsieur Poirot. I am proud of my work. I will not have it associated with deceit." "I understand," Poirot replied. "One last question." Wells paused. "If you wished to create an expression that altered depending upon the viewer's position, could you?" The artist held his gaze. "Yes," he said simply. "And did you?" Wells's eyes did not waver. "I painted what I saw." Poirot inclined his head. "Of course." Wells collected his gloves and hat at the door. He hesitated. "Families," he said quietly, "often fracture along lines already drawn. An image merely traces them, or deepens them." Poirot said. Wells offered no reply. He departed with measured steps. Left alone, Poirot stood very still. An artist understands how families fracture, he reflected. But an artist also understands how to provoke. He moved to the coffee table and poured himself a cup at last, though he did not drink it. His mind was not on coffee. Jonathan Harrington had wished to be seen clearly, not softened, not forgiven. And now, beneath a veil in the drawing room, his painted face waited, its shifting expression drawing each observer into a private reckoning. The portrait was no longer merely art. It was a promise, and someone in this house feared what that promise might reveal. Chapter 4, The Angle of Light. By mid-afternoon the house had settled into a strained quiet. Servants moved softly, as though aware that even the clink of porcelain might disturb something fragile. The portrait remained shrouded, yet its presence seemed to radiate through the corridors like a muted vibration. It was Poirot who broke the stillness. He requested that the family assemble once more in the drawing room. Margaret arrived first, her composure as exact as ever, though the lines around her mouth were more pronounced. Edwin followed, brisk and impatient, as though summoned to a board meeting he did not wish to attend. Clara entered more hesitantly, her gaze instinctively drawn to the veiled canvas. Thomas Reed came last, carrying a small leather notebook he did not open. Poirot stood before the covered portrait with quiet authority. "Thank you for indulging me," he said. "There is a small experiment I wish to conduct." Margaret regarded him coolly. "An experiment?" "Yes, a demonstration, perhaps." He turned to the footman. "Draw the curtains, please, completely." The heavy drapes were pulled across the tall windows. The pale daylight was shut out, and the room fell into a dimmer, more concentrated glow. Poirot then crossed to the side tables. "Extinguish that lamp," he instructed softly. "And that one. Leave only the chandelier and the lamp by the mantel." The room shifted at once. Shadows deepened in the corners. The central space brightened. The atmosphere grew theatrical, not flamboyant, but controlled. Poirot approached the portrait, and without flourish, removed the velvet drape. Jonathan Harrington's face emerged once more, luminous against the darker room. The crimson mark near the cane caught the chandelier's light, like a small, insistent ember. "Now," Poirot said quietly, "we shall begin." He positioned himself several feet from the canvas and studied it briefly, confirming something to himself. "Mr. Edwin," he said, "step 3 paces to your right." Edwin frowned. "Like this? Yes, precisely there. Do not move." Clara shifted uneasily. "What are you doing?" "Observing," Poirot replied. He turned to Clara. "Miss Harrington, stand where you stood last evening, just slightly left of center." She obeyed, though her hands trembled. Thomas Reed remained near the mantel. Margaret stood nearer the fire, her posture rigid. Poirot moved slowly around them, measuring the space with his eyes as though aligning invisible threads. "Look at the portrait," he instructed gently, "and tell me what you see." Edwin spoke first. His voice was tight. "The smile is sharper. There, at the corner, it lifts as though he finds something amusing or contemptible." Clara gasped softly. No, no, from here it is softer. The eyes look almost gentle. Thomas leaned slightly forward. The lips lift differently, not differently, selectively. Margaret's eyes narrowed as she studied the face from her angle. The brow appears heavier, the eyes darker. Yes, Poirot said. The highlights and shadows have been placed with extraordinary precision. He stepped closer to the canvas, examining the layered paint around the mouth and cheekbones. Observe the glazing, he murmured. The upper lip carries a faint shadow on one side, almost imperceptible from the right. It deepens the smile. From the left, it hollows it. Clara's breath caught. It truly changes. It does not change, Poirot corrected softly. It reveals. He turned to Edwin. Remain where you are. Edwin's jaw tightened, but he did not move. Poirot crossed the room and adjusted the mantel lamp slightly, tilting its shade so that its beam fell at a marginally altered angle across the canvas. The effect was immediate. The smile sharpened further on Edwin's side, the shadow beneath the lip deepening into something unmistakably sardonic. Edwin inhaled sharply. Clara, from her position, saw the opposite. The highlight along the cheek brightened, softening the entire expression. "Oh," she whispered, "it changes." Thomas swallowed. The lips lift differently, not differently, selectively. Margaret's cane tapped once against the carpet. So it was deliberate. Poirot straightened. Without doubt. The room fell silent. The conclusion, though delivered quietly, carried weight. The illusion was no accident of varnish or happenstance layering. It had been engineered, calculated to produce division. Edwin's voice was low. "You mean the painter intended this?" "I mean," Poirot said carefully, "that someone with knowledge of light and shadow intended this reaction." Thomas's eyes flicked to the crimson mark and the red stroke. "That," Poirot replied, "is of a different order." He walked slowly around the easel, examining its placement. The legs bore faint scratches, new ones as he had noted earlier. He crouched briefly, running a finger along the floorboards. Margaret watched him sharply. "What do you see?" "Movement," Poirot said. "The easel has been shifted, very slightly." Clara's hand flew to her mouth. "Shifted? Yes, a matter of inches perhaps, but inches are everything in matters of light." He rose and stepped behind the easel. The rear support had been adjusted, barely perceptible, yet not original to its assembly. "Who arranged the portrait in this room?" he asked. Thomas answered at once. "I supervised its placement." "And did you adjust it after?" "Number, did anyone?" Clara shook her head. "Not that I know." Edwin's gaze hardened. "You imply someone returned to it after it was set." "I imply that it stands precisely where it will produce maximum contrast," Poirot said. Margaret's voice was cool. "Maximum contrast between what?" "Between affection and resentment," Poirot replied evenly. "Between those who feel wronged and those who feel loyal." Clara's eyes filled with sudden tears. "That is cruel." Poirot regarded her gently. "Yes, it is." Wynne stepped forward abruptly, breaking his assigned position. The illusion shifted at once, the smile neutralized, the expression flattened. "You know of this," he snapped. "You are turning a painting into a conspiracy." Poirot watched the change in the face as Edwin moved. "Return to your place," he said quietly. Edwin hesitated, then with visible irritation stepped back to his original position. The mocking lift reappeared. Clara drew a sharp breath. Thomas Reed wiped his brow with a handkerchief. "This proves nothing beyond artistic skill." "It proves intention," Poirot replied. Margaret's eyes were intent. "Whose intention?" "The," Poirot said, "is the question." He approached the canvas once more, studying the eyes. They were painted with remarkable depth. Teeny flecks of lighter pigment embedded within darker layers, creating an illusion of moisture. "Tell me," he said softly, "when was the last time each of you stood precisely where you stand now?" Clara blinked. "Last evening." Edwin's expression darkened. "At the unveiling." Margaret nodded stiffly. "The same." Thomas hesitated. Yes. Poirot's gaze lingered on him. You are certain? Your reed swallowed. Yes. Poirot said nothing further for a moment. He adjusted the mantel lamp again, slightly higher. The effect changed once more. Now the eyes seemed more penetrating, less forgiving. The mouth, from Edwin's side, curved almost into disdain. Clara shuddered. It feels intentional, as though Father wished us to argue. Edwin laughed harshly. He always did. Margaret's voice was sharp. Jonathan sought clarity, not chaos. Poirot turned slowly to her. And sometimes clarity produces chaos, madam. The chandelier flickered faintly, casting moving shadows across the painted mouth. For an instant, the expression seemed to shift even without movement from the viewers. A trick of light, or perhaps of nerves. Poirot allowed the silence to stretch. Consider, he said at last, that the portrait does not simply divide you. It assigns you roles. Each of you stands where the face speaks differently. Mr. Edwin, you see contempt. Miss Harrington, you see kindness. Mrs. Lane, you see authority. Mr. Reed, what do you see? What do you hesitated? Judgment. Ah, Poirot murmured. Judgment. The word settled like dust. He stepped back, folding his hands behind him. The illusion is precise, engineered through shadow and highlight. The artist possesses the skill. But skill alone does not explain the placement, the timing, the crimson mark. Edwin's voice was tight. You mean this was arranged? Yes. By whom? Poirot's eyes swept the room. By someone who understood not only paint, he said softly, but people. The fire crackled faintly, no one spoke. At last Margaret said, very quietly, What do you propose to do? Poirot smiled faintly, though his eyes were grave. I propose, he said, to discover who wished the late Mr. Harrington to accuse his family from beyond the grave. The portrait, bathed in carefully chosen light, seemed almost to approve. And for the first time, each of them wondered not merely what they saw in the painting, but what it saw in them. Chapter 5. Old wounds. By early evening, the Harrington house had lost all pretense of normality. Wordless exchanges replaced conversation. Doors closed more firmly than necessary. Even the servants sensed that something long suppressed had risen to the surface. The portrait remained in the drawing room, uncovered now, as if concealment had proven futile. It stood illuminated by carefully placed lamps, no longer by accident, but by awareness. Each member of the family had begun to understand that where one stood determined what one saw, and that in itself was dangerous. Poirot had requested tea. It was served with quiet precision in the long dining room, though none of the 4 Harrington relations appeared inclined to drink it. The air felt dense, as though each inhalation required deliberation. Thomas Reed held a folded document in his hand. The will, he said at last. It is to be read tomorrow morning at 10, as Mr. Harrington specified. Specified? Edwin repeated with a thin smile. Father always specified. Clara clasped her hands together. He said he wanted us all present. Margaret's gaze was steady. That is customary. He did not interrupt. He had learned that when families approached the subject of inheritance, the truth emerged less through statements than through tone. Edwin rose and began to pace, much as Wells had described from the portrait sittings. Father never trusted me with the estate, he said abruptly. Clara's head lifted. That is your imagination again. Is it? Edwin's eyes flashed. He kept control of every account. Every decision required his approval. Even in my 30s, I was a subordinate. Margaret's voice cut across the room. We have not even read the will. Exactly, Edwin snapped. We have not read it, yet we all feel its shadow. Poirot spoke softly. Yet already you prepare your defenses. The words landed with precision. Thomas Reed shifted uneasily. It is natural to speculate. Speculation, Poirot said, is often the beginning of accusation. Clara turned toward the doorway, beyond which the portrait stood. It feels as though he is judging us. Edwin laughed without humor. He always did. Margaret's gaze hardened. Jonathan judged performance. He valued competence and punished failure, Edwin replied sharply. Thomas cleared his throat. Mr. Harrington believed in discipline. Discipline, Edwin repeated. Is that what you call humiliation? The word lingered heavily. Poirot's eyes sharpened. Humiliation. Edwin stopped pacing. For a moment he seemed almost surprised that the word had escaped him. Father corrected errors publicly, he said at last. He believed embarrassment was instructive. Clara flinched slightly. Margaret's voice was controlled. He believed in strength. And weakness, Edwin demanded. What did he believe about that? Clara's voice was barely audible. He thought it could be overcome. Poirot watched her carefully. And could it? He asked gently. She did not answer. Thomas unfolded the document in his hand, then folded it again without reading. The portrait, he said abruptly, as though seizing safer ground, seems to suggest approval or condemnation, depending on where one stands. The smile condemns someone, Margaret said quietly. Poirot turned toward her, or encourages someone to believe it does. Edwin's jaw tightened. That someone is not me. Is it not? Margaret asked coolly. The exchange was swift, sharp, like blades crossing. Poirot rose slowly from his chair. Let us return to the drawing room, he suggested. I wish to observe something further. They obeyed with reluctant unity. The portrait greeted them with its silent, shifting gaze. Lamps remained arranged as Poirot had set them earlier. The effect was unmistakable. From the right, the smile tightened into a faint sneer. From the left, it softened almost into benevolence. Edwin moved instinctively to his earlier position, as though drawn by habit. Clara stood opposite him. Margaret remained slightly apart. Thomas hovered nearer the mantel. Notice, Poirot said quietly, how swiftly you resume your places. No one replied. Mr. Edwin, Poirot continued, you feel condemned. I feel observed, Edwin corrected. And you, Miss Harrington? I feel reassured. And you, Mrs. Lane? Margaret's eyes did not leave the canvas. I see resolve. And you, Mr. Reed? Thomas hesitated. I see scrutiny. One painting, he said softly. 4 interpretations. Each interpretation aligns conveniently with private grievance. Edwin turned sharply. You think we are inventing insult? I think, Poirot replied, that you are responding to something already within you. Clara stepped closer to the portrait. From her angle, the eyes seemed almost compassionate. He did love us, she whispered. Edwin's voice was low. Did he? Margaret's tone sharpened. Ina, this is morbid. Poirot approached the canvas once more, studying the mouth. Tell me, he said lightly, did Mr. Harrington ever express doubt regarding any of you? Silence. Thomas shifted. He believed the estate required firm management. That is not my question, Poirot said gently. Edwin's face hardened. He doubted my judgment. Clara's eyes widened. He never said that. He did not need to say it, Edwin replied. Margaret's voice was cool. Jonathan expected excellence. From you, perhaps. Edwin shot back. Poirot's gaze moved between them, attentive to every nuance. And Miss Harrington? He asked. Clara hesitated. He worried I was too trusting. Thomas looked away quickly. And you, Mr. Reed? Poirot asked softly. Reed's voice was strained. He trusted me with his affairs. Yes, Poirot said. He trusted you with much. The crimson mark caught the light again, small yet vivid. Poirot regarded it thoughtfully. Curious, he murmured, that the mark lies near the cane, a symbol of authority, of control. Edwin's gaze followed his. It looks like blood. Clara recoiled slightly. Do not say that. But it does, Edwin insisted. A drop. Margaret's eyes flashed. It is paint. Paint can accuse, Edwin said. Poirot turned to him. Accuse of what? Edwin hesitated just long enough to be noticed. Of betrayal, he said finally. The word reverberated in the quiet room. Thomas's hand tightened around his notebook. Poirot's voice was calm. Betrayal suggests a prior trust. There was trust, Edwin replied sharply, until there was not. Margaret stepped forward, her cane striking the floor. You speak in riddles. No, Edwin said. I speak in experience. Clara's voice trembled. You think father changed the will? Edwin did not answer. Thomas's face paled. Poirot's gaze sharpened almost imperceptibly. Ah, he said softly, so that is the wound. The room seemed to constrict. Margaret's eyes moved swiftly to Thomas. You would know, Reed swallowed. The will was revised 6 weeks before Mr. Harrington's death. Clara gasped. Revised? Yes, Edwin's voice was dangerously quiet. Revised how? Thomas's fingers trembled slightly. I cannot disclose its contents before the formal reading. Convenient, Edwin muttered. Poirot stepped between them, not physically, but in tone. You see, he said gently, the portrait divides more efficiently than any spoken accusation. Already suspicion shifts. Margaret's voice was cold. If Jonathan altered his will, he had reason. And what reason might that be? Edwin demanded. Silence again. Poirot observed the angles of their bodies, the distances between them. No two stood equidistant. Alliances formed and dissolved in glances. The painting, he said quietly, is not merely a likeness. It is a mirror. Each of you sees what you fear. Clara's eyes filled with tears. I do not fear him. No, Poirot agreed. You fear losing him. Edwin's voice hardened, and I fear being erased. Thomas looked at the portrait as though it might speak. The smile condemns someone, he said again, more faintly. Poirot turned slowly toward him. Or encourages someone to believe it does. Thomas looked away. Edwin's gaze burned. You think one of us added that red mark? I think, Poirot replied carefully, that someone wished to intensify what already existed. Margaret's voice dropped. You suspect sabotage. I suspect intention. Clara stepped backward, as though the portrait's gaze had grown too heavy. If father wished to judge us, she whispered, why not do it openly? Poirot's eyes rested on the painted face. Because, he said softly, a silent judge is far more powerful. The lamps flickered slightly. The shadow beneath the mouth deepened for an instant, then softened again. And in that subtle shift, the old wounds of the Harrington family seemed to widen, no longer hidden beneath courtesy, no longer dulled by grief. The portrait had not spoken, but it had begun to decide who believed themselves condemned, and that belief, Poirot knew, could drive a person to act. Chapter 6. The night disturbance the Harrington house did not sleep easily. Though the lamps were extinguished one by one and the servants withdrew to their quarters, wakefulness lingered in the walls. The portrait had been left in the long gallery adjoining the drawing-room, at Poirot's quiet suggestion. It should remain where it can be observed, he had said, with a tone that suggested he meant more than the obvious. Edwin retired late, footsteps echoing sharply against the marble tiles. Clara paused outside the gallery before ascending the stairs, gazing once more at her father's painted face. Margaret withdrew with stiff dignity, her cane striking the floor in precise rhythm. Thomas Reed remained behind briefly, as though ensuring doors were secured. Poirot, invited to remain as a guest, occupied a small chamber overlooking the square. He did not undress immediately. Instead, he sat at the edge of the bed, considering angles, of light, of character, of motive. Near midnight, the crash came. It was not loud enough to shatter glass or bring servants screaming, but it was distinct, a heavy thud followed by a scraping sound that reverberated along the corridor. Poirot was on his feet at once. Doors opened along the upper landing. Clara's voice, alarmed and thin, broke the silence. What was that? Edwin's door flew open, downstairs. Margaret emerged moments later, composed, but pale. They converged upon the gallery. A single wall lamp had been left burning. Its glow cast elongated shadows across the polished floor. The easel lay overturned. The portrait of Jonathan Harrington had fallen forward. Its gilded frame cracked at one corner, and across the canvas, cut. The authority in his voice silenced them. He moved once more to the torn canvas, touching the edge of the frame lightly. "Whoever did this," he said quietly, "did not wish to obliterate the portrait, only to wound it. To wound it." Clara echoed. "Yes, a single strike, across the mouth, as though to prevent speech." Widwin's expression hardened further. "Then it is exactly as I said. Someone feared what it revealed." "Perhaps," Poirot replied. "Or perhaps someone wished to intensify that fear." Thomas stared at him. "What do you mean?" Poirot straightened. "The portrait divided you," he said. "It suggested condemnation to some, approval to others. By slashing it in this manner, the culprit ensures that suspicion sharpens. Now the question is no longer what the painting means, but who silenced it." Margaret's voice was low. "And that benefits whom? Someone who prefers chaos to clarity." Clara's gaze darted between them. "But why?" Poirot regarded her gently. "Because chaos conceals." The wind pressed faintly against the gallery windows. Edwin spoke slowly. "You think the portrait revealed something specific?" "I think," Poirot replied, "that your father intended it to." Thomas's breathing quickened slightly. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "And what would that be?" Poirot's gaze returned to the crimson mark near the cane. "The red stroke," he said softly, "and the positioning of light." He crouched once more, examining the fibers along the cut. "The blade was sharp," he murmured, "handled steadily, not a trembling hand." Midwin's voice was tight. "Then you believe this was deliberate?" "Yes, then one of us." Poirot rose slowly, interrupting him. "Do not leap to conclusions, Mr. Edwin. That would be most convenient for the true culprit." The gallery seemed to hold its breath. Clara's voice was almost inaudible. "You think this is not about inheritance?" Poirot looked at her. "No," he said. "I think it is about fear." "Fear of what?" Margaret demanded. Poirot's eyes moved from one to the other. "Fear." Silence followed. The torn canvas lay between them, its wounded mouth now permanently divided. And in that careful slash, neither wild nor hesitant, Poirot saw not anger, but calculation. Even vandalism, he reflected, can be measured. And measurement suggests a mind at work. Chapter 7. The hidden layer the morning after the disturbance arrived with a thin, impartial light that seemed to wash the Harrington house in a kind of reluctant honesty. Belgrave Square outside wore its customary dignity, carriages passing with measured restraint, pedestrians wrapped against the chill, the iron railings beaded with a faint winter damp inside. However, the air had changed. A night noise in a respectable house does not fade like a dream. It leaves behind a residue, a suspicion that settles into corners and clings to objects. In the long gallery, that residue seemed to concentrate around the portrait. The canvas had been raised again and set upright against the wall, supported now by 2 chairs and a folded blanket to prevent further strain on the frame. The gilt corner that had cracked had been steadied with careful binding, as though the household could not bear to see even the frame wounded. The slash one single controlled line still ran across Jonathan Harrington's mouth in a diagonal that felt almost purposeful in its cruelty. The velvet drape lay nearby, unused. After the night's discovery, no one wished to cover the painting again, as if concealment had become a kind of complicity. Hercule Poirot arrived in the gallery with his usual composure, yet there was a particular neatness to him this morning, as though he wished his own orderliness to stand in opposition to the disorder that had visited the house. He had requested, before anyone touched the canvas further, that the family allow him to examine it in daylight. They had agreed, though agreement among them had become less a matter of unity and more a matter of necessity. Clara was the first to appear. She came quietly, wrapped in a pale shawl, her face drawn with sleeplessness. She stood at the threshold as though uncertain whether she had the right to enter a room where her father's likeness had been violated. Edwin arrived next, briskly, his anger worn like armor. He did not pause at the threshold. He marched straight to the portrait and halted before it, his gaze fixed upon the cut with an intensity that suggested he could will it to reverse itself. Margaret Lane entered last, leaning upon her cane. She moved with the measured. "Mr. Wells," Poirot said gently, You told me previously that the dual expression was accidental, an effect of varnish and glazing. Wells's jaw tightened. It can occur. Can it occur so precisely? Poirot asked. That one angle yields warmth, and the other yields contempt. Can accident choose sides with such accuracy? Wells opened his mouth, then closed it. Poirot moved the lamp beam upward, grazing the cheek and eye. Under the finished layers, faint structural lines appeared, two arrangements of shadow around the brow, as though one draft had intended the eyes to soften and the other to harden. It is not only the mouth, Poirot continued. The brow was drafted twice, the lines around the eyes twice. The whole expression is bifurcated. Margaret's fingers tightened around her cane. So you did it deliberately. Wells's voice rose slightly. I did it artistically. Do not hide behind the word, Edwin said coldly. You created a portrait that judges differently depending on the viewer. That is not neutral. Wells flushed. Portraiture is never neutral. Poirot's tone remained calm. You anticipated the unveiling would stir emotion. Wells hesitated, then answered as if clinging to principle. Emotion is the purpose of portraiture. Poirot inclined his head. But conflict. Wells's eyes flicked away for a fraction of a second. I paint what I see in a man. Margaret's voice cut in, sharp with restraint. Father was decisive, not cruel. Wells replied evenly, perhaps too evenly. Then perhaps some saw cruelty in him. Poirot's gaze sharpened, or wished to. The words seemed to strike the air like a small, precise blow. Clara stared at the exposed underlayer, as though it were a bruise appearing under skin. Poirot stepped back from the canvas and removed the magnifying lens from his eye. He turned to face them all. Let us be honest, he said quietly. This portrait has functioned like a test. Each of you has stood where it speaks to you in a particular way, and each of you has believed the portrait confirms something private: condemnation, approval, judgment, comfort. He let the words settle, then added, Now you see that the division was drafted from the beginning. Thomas Reed, who had remained unusually silent, cleared his throat. Mr. Wells may have explored two expressions during early stages. That does not prove he intended this effect. Poirot turned his head slightly toward Reed. Does it not? Reed's lips tightened. It proves only that artists sketch variations. Poirot's gaze lingered on him a moment longer than politeness required. Then he looked back at Wells. Mr. Wells, Poirot said, did Mr. Harrington ask you to paint him in two ways? Wells's answer came quickly. Number Wynn's laugh was short. He did not need to ask. He would have suggested. Wells stiffened. He sat. I observed. Poirot's voice was mild. And yet you produced an effect that depends upon the room, upon lamps, upon curtains. Wells hesitated. Any painting depends on light. Yes, Poirot said. But not every painting depends on a particular arrangement of light to produce two distinct moral readings. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Moral readings? Warmth implies benevolence, Poirot said softly. Contempt implies condemnation. Those are not merely aesthetic differences. They are judgments. Clara's voice trembled. So father planned to make us feel judged. Poirot did not answer at once. He stepped closer to the painting again, this time examining not the exposed underlayer, but the direction of the cut itself. The slash had been made with remarkable intention, not only in its cleanliness, but in its placement. It cut through the mouth, not the eyes, not the cane, not the crimson mark, the mouth. As though to silence, Clara whispered again. Poirot nodded faintly, or as though to force another kind of speech. Wells blinked. What do you mean? Poirot turned his head slightly, and his eyes seemed almost to brighten. This cut, he said, has exposed the underlayer at exactly the point where it matters most. The mouth, whoever made it knew what would be revealed by a controlled slice through varnish and paint. Edwin's shoulders tensed. You think the vandal did this to show us the truth? I think, Poirot replied, that the vandal wanted you to see that the division was not your imagination. Margaret's face paled by a degree that is monstrous. Monstrous, Poirot agreed quietly, and intelligent. Thomas Reed spoke again, his voice careful. But how could anyone know there were 2 drafts beneath? Unless... He stopped. Poirot's gaze moved to him immediately. Unless Mr. Wells told someone. Wells's head snapped up. I told no one. Poirot's eyes remained steady. Did you show anyone the preliminary stages? Wells hesitated. It is not customary. Poirot waited. Wells exhaled. Mr. Harrington saw progress. He visited my studio once. Clara's eyes widened. Father went to your studio. Yes, Wells said stiffly. Near the end, he wished to see it before it was delivered. Margaret's jaw tightened. He did not mention that. Widwin's voice was low, because he did not share. Poirot nodded slightly, as if placing a tile into an existing mosaic. And Mr. Harrington, Poirot asked gently, did he stand before the canvas? Did he move from side to side? Wells hesitated again. Then reluctantly, he said, yes. And what did he say? Wells's voice dropped. He said it was instructive. Clara pressed a hand to her mouth. Poirot's gaze drifted briefly to the crimson mark near the cane, the small stroke that had ignited the first true shock of the unveiling. It remained untouched by the slash, yet it now seemed more ominous, as if it had been spared intentionally. Mr. Wells, Poirot asked quietly, did you paint the crimson mark? Wells's answer was immediate and emphatic. Number Margaret's eyes flashed. Then how did it appear? Poirot did not reply. He was watching Thomas Reed now, not openly, but with the kind of attention that feels like weather changing. Mr. Reed, Poirot said softly, you supervised the placement of the portrait in this house. Yes, Reed replied, too quickly. And the lighting. I followed instructions. Whose instructions? Reed's lips tightened. Mr. Harrington's Widwin's head turned sharply. Father told you where to place the lamps. Reed's face paled. He specified how he wished it displayed. Clara stared at him. When? Before his death, Reed said, voice strained. In writing. Poirot's eyes gleamed faintly. In writing. Margaret's cane tapped once, a sharp punctuation, so Jonathan orchestrated the room. Reed's voice faltered. He was particular. Poirot stepped closer to Reed, still polite, still calm, but with a pressure in his presence that made the man seem smaller. And did Mr. Harrington, Poirot asked, also specify that the unveiling should occur before the reading of the will? Yes, Reed admitted. Edwin's voice was bitter. So the portrait was meant to prepare us. To disturb you, Poirot corrected gently, to position you emotionally before you heard the legal truth. Clara's eyes filled. That is cruel. Poirot's expression softened. Or protective, one cannot yet decide. Margaret's composure wavered for the first time. Protective of what? Poirot turned back to the portrait, studying it as though it might answer. The question, he said quietly, is not only who cut the canvas, the question is why the canvas needed to be cut at all. Wells's voice came out tight. Because someone wished to destroy my work. No, Poirot replied. Because someone wished to reveal what your work contained. Wells stared at him. And someone, Poirot added, wished to do so before the will is read. A hush fell. The words created a new shape in the room, one with sharper edges than their earlier arguments. Edwin stared at the portrait as if seeing, not his father's face, but a trap laid in paint. Clara's voice was barely audible. So the vandal is trying to control the story. Yes, Poirot said softly, to accelerate it. Thomas Reed's breath shortened, almost imperceptibly. Poirot noticed. He also noticed the way Reed's eyes drifted, again and again to the crimson mark. Poirot stepped closer to the painting one final time and angled the lamp so that it illuminated the exposed underlayer near the mouth. The 2 drafts seemed to coexist like 2 thoughts in the same mind, one gentle, one severe. The finished mouth had been engineered to borrow from each depending on the light. The division was painted into existence, Poirot said quietly. From the beginning. Wells's voice sounded suddenly tired. You speak as though I intended harm. Poirot turned his head. Did you? Wells held his gaze, then looked away. I intended to paint truth. And truth, Poirot said softly, can be used as a weapon. Margaret's voice was controlled but strained. You suggest Jonathan Harrington used the portrait as a weapon. I suggest, Poirot replied, that he prepared a stage. Widwin's face tightened, and now someone is rearranging it. Yes, Poirot said, by cutting the canvas in a way that reveals the hidden layer, and by doing so at the moment when suspicion is already raw. Clara looked at the slash, then at Poirot. You think the same person added the crimson mark? Poirot's eyes remained on the painting. I think the same mind is shaping your reactions. Wells swallowed. Then you believe someone in this house understands paint? Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he removed his gloves with meticulous care and folded them, placing them neatly on the table. His calmness was almost unsettling, because it suggested that what they had discovered did not shock him. It confirmed him. Mr. Wells, Poirot said at last, you claimed the dual expression was accidental. We now see it was drafted. You claimed the unveiling's effect was an unintended consequence. We now see the portrait was designed to respond to position and light. Wells's face tightened. Design is not always malice. No, Poirot agreed, but it is always choice. He turned toward the family. Tonight, he said, you will be tempted to do what you have done since the unveiling, to accuse one another, to believe that the painting condemns this one and comforts that one, but the painting is only the instrument. Edwin's voice was rough. Then who holds it? Poirot's gaze traveled, calmly, slowly, across Clara, across Edwin, across Margaret, and finally to Thomas Reed. The person who cut this canvas, Poirot said softly, wished you to see the hidden layer. That person understood exactly what the cut would reveal and exactly how you would react. Clara whispered, so it is someone close. Yes, Poirot replied. Wells's voice trembled slightly. This is madness. Poirot's tone remained gentle, but his words carried weight. No, he said. It is strategy. He glanced once more at the exposed underpainting. 2 mouths, 2 truths, 1 face. Then his eyes lifted to meet theirs. An artist experiments, Poirot said, echoing Wells's defense. But an artist also anticipates consequence. And the person who exposed this hidden layer anticipated consequence too. The gallery felt suddenly smaller, as if the walls had moved inward. Edwin's voice was low, unfinished. Then one of us. Poirot did not stop him this time. He allowed the sentence to hang incomplete, because the incompleteness was itself a danger. And while they stood there, 4 heirs and 1 artist staring at a wounded portrait, Poirot's mind moved quietly ahead, tracing the invisible line from underpainting to varnish, from crimson mark to controlled slash, from grief to suspicion. The portrait had been designed to divide. But now, with its hidden layer exposed, it offered something else as well, not merely division, but a clue. Chapter 8, Motive in the division. If the revelation of the hidden underpainting unsettled the Harrington household, what followed unsettled it further still. By late afternoon, Poirot had withdrawn to the small study adjoining the gallery, requesting access to several practical matters: correspondence relating to the portrait's commission, delivery receipts, insurance documents, and any financial agreements connected with the work. Thomas Reed, pale but compliant, produced what was required from a locked cabinet. The study smelled faintly of leather and ink. Jonathan Harrington's desk, broad, severe, and meticulously organized, dominated the room. It seemed almost inappropriate that anyone else should sit behind it. And yet Poirot did so without ceremony. He arranged the papers before him with deliberate precision. Edwin paced near the fireplace. Clara sat quietly in a high-backed chair, fingers intertwined in her lap. Margaret stood by the window, gaze outward, as though the square beyond offered more rational company than the room within. Adrian Wells remained near the doorway, summoned again at Poirot's insistence, his composure thinning with each development. Poirot adjusted his spectacles and examined a particular sheet more closely. "Mr. Wells," he said mildly, "may I trouble you for clarification regarding this document?" Wells's posture stiffened. "Which document?" "This one." Poirot lifted the page lightly. "An insurance certificate." Thomas Reed shifted. "That was arranged at Mr. Harrington's request," Reed said quickly. "Indeed," Poirot replied. "It insures the portrait for a sum equal to twice the original commission." Widwin stopped pacing twice. Clara looked up sharply. "Why?" Wells stepped forward, his tone controlled but tight. "It is common practice to insure valuable works above commission value, particularly before public unveiling." Poirot's gaze remained steady, a precaution. "Yes," Wynne's voice hardened, "or an investment." Wells flushed. "I resent the implication." Poirot laid the document flat and smoothed it with one careful hand. "I do not imply," he said softly. "I inquire." Margaret turned from the window. Jonathan was prudent. He would not have objected to insurance. "No," Poirot agreed. "He would not." He lifted another paper, this one a brief memorandum bearing Jonathan Harrington's unmistakable signature. "However," Poirot continued, "this note is less customary." Thomas Reed's face drained further of color. "What note?" Edwin demanded. Poirot read aloud, his voice even. "In the event that the unveiling of the portrait generates notable public interest or commentary, an additional remuneration shall be awarded to the artist, contingent upon such notoriety increasing the declared valuation of the work." Silence followed. Clara blinked. "An additional remuneration." Widwin's eyes narrowed. "A bonus." Margaret's voice was low and incredulous. Jonathan promised a bonus for notoriety. Wells spoke quickly. "It was Mr. Harrington's idea." Poirot's gaze shifted to him. "And you accepted?" "I am an artist," Wells replied, his composure thinning. "Public interest benefits my career." "Public interest," Poirot echoed. "Or public controversy?" Wells hesitated. Edwin's voice sharpened. "You manipulated us." "I only painted what I saw," Wells insisted. Poirot's expression did not change. "And ensured we would not see the same thing." The words settled heavily in the room. Clara looked from one to the other, as though the air itself had become difficult to breathe. "You mean, you intended us to argue?" Wells shook his head, but the movement lacked conviction. "I intended to paint complexity." "And you insured complexity at twice its price," Edwin retorted. Margaret stepped forward, her cane striking the carpet with quiet authority. "Jonathan enjoyed spectacle," she said slowly, as if conceding a truth long resisted. "He believed attention equaled power." "Yes," Poirot said softly. "And controversy equals attention." Thomas Reed spoke, his voice strained. "The memorandum does not specify conflict. It speaks only of public interest." Poirot turned his head slightly. "Public interest does not arise from tranquility, Mr. Reed." He folded the memorandum and placed it beside the insurance certificate. "Consider," Poirot continued, addressing them all, "a portrait unveiled quietly before a harmonious family. It is admired, perhaps praised, and then it fades into decorous obscurity." He paused. "Now consider a portrait that divides the heirs of a prominent estate." Whispers spread. Visitors speak of the changing expression. The press hears of tension before a substantial will reading. Clara's eyes widened. "The press?" Widwin swore under his breath. Wells shifted uneasily. "I never contacted any journalist." "Not yet," Poirot replied. Margaret's voice sharpened. "You suggest the argument itself was valuable." Poirot inclined his head. "The argument was the masterpiece." Margaret stared at him. "Precisely, the word fell like a verdict." Edwin ran a hand through his hair. "So the painting was designed to provoke division. The more we disagreed, the more valuable it became." Wells's composure began to fracture. "It was not so crude." "No," Edwin demanded. "I am not a merchant of scandal." Poirot regarded him steadily. "Profit hides comfortably behind artistic ambiguity," he said softly. Wells's lips parted, but no immediate defense emerged. Clara's voice trembled. But the slash, the vandalism, that reduces value. On the contrary, Poirot said. Damage increases narrative, a portrait that divides and is then slashed under mysterious circumstances, before a will is read, becomes legend. Thomas Reed swallowed audibly. Margaret's eyes darkened. Are you suggesting the destruction was calculated as well? I suggest, Poirot replied, that drama compounds profit. Wells shook his head, almost pleading now. I did not cut the canvas. Poirot's gaze sharpened slightly. That remains to be seen. Widwin turned sharply toward Wells. You insured it for twice its value. You had a bonus contingent on notoriety, and now it lies slashed. Wells's face reddened. You think I would vandalize my own work? Would you? Poirot asked gently. Wells's answer came with force. Number silence. Poirot rose from the desk and walked slowly toward the center of the room, hands folded behind his back. Let us analyze motive calmly, he said. A portrait insured beyond commission, a bonus promised upon increased valuation through public attention, an unveiling scheduled before a will reading likely to stir its own tensions. He turned slightly. Add to this a carefully engineered dual expression, and then a precisely placed slash that reveals hidden underpainting and intensifies intrigue. Clara shivered. It is monstrous, she whispered. It is business, Edwin corrected bitterly. Margaret's voice was cool and reflective. Jonathan would have admired the strategy. Poirot's eyes flicked toward her. Perhaps. Thomas Reed spoke cautiously. The insurance payout would require investigation. Damage alone does not guarantee profit. True, Poirot agreed, but reputation does not require payout. It requires story. He glanced at Wells. And story, Mr. Wells, is the currency of art. Wells's shoulders slumped slightly. I paint, he said quietly. I do not stage melodrama. Do you not? Poirot asked. Wells met his gaze with effort. I did not slash the portrait. Widwin's tone sharpened. But you might have benefited. Wells's silence was answer enough to deepen suspicion. Clara looked to Poirot, her voice fragile. If the argument was part of the design, then father knew. Poirot's expression softened for a moment. Your father, he said gently, understood human nature. He understood that division magnifies attention, whether he intended financial gain or moral revelation, or both, is a separate question. Margaret spoke slowly. Jonathan always believed conflict clarified loyalty. Yes, Poirot said, and conflict also clarifies fear. Thomas shifted again, uneasy. Mr. Wells, Poirot continued, when you accepted this commission with its unusual financial clause, did you consider how you might increase notoriety? Wells's eyes flickered. I considered, he said carefully, that strong reaction is preferable to indifference, and you ensured strong reaction. I painted honestly, and selectively, Poirot replied. Margaret looked from the documents to the portrait, visible through the study door. So the unveiling was engineered, the duality was engineered, the bonus incentivized controversy. And the slash? Edwin pressed. Poirot turned his gaze slowly toward Thomas Reed. That, he said softly, is the remaining piece. Reed stiffened. Why look at me? Because, Poirot replied calmly, you handled the insurance, you arranged the delivery, you supervised placement, and you knew of the bonus clause. Reed's breathing quickened. That proves nothing. Not yet, Poirot agreed. Clara rose unsteadily. So someone stood to profit. Yes, and someone ensured the portrait became infamous. Yes, Margaret's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Infamy lingers longer than admiration. Indeed, Poirot said. Edwin looked toward the gallery, where the wounded portrait stood like an accusation. You mean, he said slowly, that we were never the true audience? Poirot's lips curved faintly. You were the ignition, he said. Not the audience. Silence followed. Heavier now, less emotional and more calculating. Wells looked suddenly older. I did not cut the canvas. he repeated quietly. Poirot studied him, then nodded slightly. Perhaps not. Widwin's eyes flashed. Then who? Poirot's gaze shifted, once more, toward Thomas Reed. Someone, he said softly, who understands that division increases value, and that timing is everything. Reed's face drained of color. Margaret spoke slowly, her voice controlled but cold. If the slash heightened the drama before the will reading, then it was meant to influence our interpretation of that will. Yes, Poirot replied, or to distract from it. Clara whispered, distract from what? Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned toward the gallery door and regarded the wounded portrait at a distance. The argument, he said quietly, was indeed the masterpiece. He glanced back at Wells, and someone, he added, ensured the masterpiece would not fade quietly into a drawing room. The air in the study seemed to tighten further. Edwin's voice was low and tense. So the painting divided us, the insurance rewarded controversy, and the slash amplified it. Yes, then the portrait is not merely art. No, Poirot said. It is leverage. Thomas Reed's hand trembled slightly against the back of a chair. Poirot saw it. And in that tremor, faint but unmistakable, he sensed that the true masterpiece had not been the portrait at all, but the manipulation of those who stood before it. Chapter 9. The calculated slash the atmosphere in the Harrington Gallery. That evening was no longer one of shock, nor even of grief. It was expectation. The portrait, still wounded, still propped upright, seemed less like a victim and more like evidence. The single diagonal slash across Jonathan Harrington. You believed you controlled the narrative, he said. You believed that by dividing perception, you could orchestrate intrigue. Wells's gaze wavered. Yes, but you underestimated something. Wells's eyes flicked to him. What? Poirot's voice was almost gentle. You underestimated that pride leaves traces. Wells swallowed. The blade, Poirot continued. You carry it habitually, a small trimming knife, sharp, well maintained. When you examined the portrait yesterday, you touched the cut too closely. Wells's face paled further. You pressed lightly against the seam, Poirot said, as if assessing your own workmanship. Clara's breath caught. And you left fibers, Poirot finished. Wells's shoulders sagged. I could not resist seeing it, he admitted softly. I wanted to know whether the underlayer showed, as I intended. Intended, Edwin repeated bitterly. Yes, Wells said. I intended the hidden draft to be glimpsed, not fully exposed, just enough to provoke speculation. Margaret's voice was controlled, but trembling beneath. You orchestrated fear. I orchestrated fascination, Wells corrected. Poirot's gaze remained steady. You sharpened division, he said quietly. And in doing so, you relied upon the assumption that this family's suspicion would shield you. Wells did not deny it. Clara's voice was small. You thought we would never look beyond ourselves. Yes, Wells said. Poirot inclined his head slightly. And you were almost correct. The admission carried weight. Edwin's voice was tight. Why confess now? Wells gave a hollow laugh. Because you noticed the fibers, he said, and because I misjudged you. Poirot's expression did not change. You misjudged not me, he said softly. You misjudged consequence. Wells looked toward the portrait one last time. I did not foresee how far suspicion would travel, he admitted. I believed it would remain aesthetic. Margaret's eyes flashed. Division is never merely aesthetic. No, Poirot agreed. Silence settled once more. The slashed portrait stood between them, a symbol now not only of family fracture, but of calculated exploitation. Wells's voice, stripped of bravado, was almost weary. I wanted recognition, he said, to create something that would not be forgotten. Poirot regarded him thoughtfully. And you have, he said, but not as you imagined. Widwin turned away, anger simmering. Clara looked at the portrait differently now. Not as a judge, nor as a father, but as an instrument. Margaret straightened her shoulders, dignity reasserting itself. Thomas Reed avoided Wells's eyes entirely. Poirot stepped back from the canvas. "The portrait divided perception," he said quietly. "You deepened that division, but division alone does not create guilt." Wells looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" Poirot's gaze flicked briefly, almost imperceptibly, toward Thomas Reed. "It means," he said softly, "that while you sharpened suspicion, you were not the only one who benefited from it." He underestimated the resilience of those he divided. Lidwin's expression shifted, subtly. Less anger now, more resolve. "We were foolish," he said. "Not foolish," Poirot corrected. "Human." Clara stepped closer to the portrait again. The torn mouth no longer seemed accusatory. It seemed almost fragile. "He looks tired," she murmured. Margaret's gaze softened at last. "He worked tirelessly," she said. "He expected the same." Edwin nodded once, and resented what he feared was weakness. Clara glanced at him. "And perhaps we resented what we feared was judgment." Poirot's eyes warmed slightly. "You begin to see." Thomas shifted, thoughtful. "The inheritance," he said slowly, "is not only money." "No," Poirot agreed. "It is memory and interpretation." Margaret straightened. "Then we must choose our interpretation wisely." "Precisely," Poirot said. The last of the daylight faded beyond the windows. The chandelier's steady glow remained, no longer angled for drama, but balanced. The portrait, though scarred, appeared calmer. The extreme contrasts had softened into coherence. Jonathan Harrington's face seemed less like a judge and more like a reminder. Edwin looked at his sister. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "whatever the will contains, we face it together." Clara nodded. "Yes." Margaret inclined her head in agreement. Thomas exhaled, as though releasing something he had carried too long. Poirot observed them without intrusion. Division, he knew, does not vanish at a single declaration. It recedes slowly, like a shadow moving as the sun shifts. But the first step toward unity is the recognition that one has been standing too long in a single angle of light. Clara spoke again softly. "Without the shadow, he looks simply father." Edwin allowed himself the faintest smile. "And perhaps that is enough." Poirot folded his hands behind his back and regarded the portrait one final time. "A single expression," he said quietly, "is rarely the whole truth, but a balanced light reveals what exaggeration conceals." Margaret turned toward him. "You have given us more than an answer," she said. Poirot inclined his head. "I have merely adjusted the lamps." A faint, almost reluctant laugh passed between them. The house no longer felt like a courtroom. It felt, at last, like a home, one that had confronted its distortions and chosen clarity instead. As they began to disperse, Clara lingered a moment longer before the portrait. She did not seek warmth or severity now. She simply looked. Thomas paused at the doorway. "It reflects the viewer," he said again, more firmly. Poirot smiled faintly. "Just so." He turned toward the corridor, leaving the family before the damaged yet dignified image of their patriarch. Behind him, under steady light, the portrait no longer divided. It endured. And in that endurance, scarred, human, and unexaggerated, the Harrington family found something far more valuable than notoriety or wealth. They found perspective, and with it, the possibility of unity restored.